So good morning. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'll say it again right now. If you haven't downloaded the slides, you can do it by scanning this QR code. If that's not working, I'll probably post the link on Twitter at some point. So let's get going. So I'll let you shoot that right now. You got it? Oh no, please go by all means. Okay. Let me start. Bonjour, hello. My name's Henri. My last name is not really Helvetica. It's just something that I use sort of for fun, but it's kind of worked out at conferences as well. I just thought it was a very interesting handle, and it's something that spoke to both developers and designers, which I have an appreciation for. So that's what I ended up using. You could actually find me on Twitter at that handle as well. You have any questions about what I'm going to talk about today, and you want to send me praise or less praise, let me know. You could always tweet me, but I'm usually pretty prompt on Twitter to get back to folks. I want to actually, before I get into the nitty-gritty, I actually want to shout out a few people. I want to shout out Beth, I want to shout out Erica, I want to shout out Angel for putting this great conference together. It's my first time in Atlanta. I've had a fabulous time. So, I mean, on camera, I just want to say shout out. Thank you very much for having me. So, quickly, I mentioned my name's Henri. I'm from the greatest city on the planet called Toronto. Boom, I heard there was a Toronto native in the building. Let's go. Super multicultural city, an incredible tapestry of people, a very multicultural fabric. So if you're ever in the area, come through. Especially if you're American, that dollar exchange is going to make you feel like a king or a queen. This is a shot of a Caribbean festival that we have called Caravana that I attend every year. I mean, West Indies runs in my blood, so that's that there. So quickly, I'm a freelance developer. I'm in Toronto, but when I do conferences, I tend to talk about web performance. That's an area of the web that I love to sort of like dissect and parse quite often. Super interesting. I actually run the Toronto, I'll co-run actually the Toronto Web Performance Meetup Group. So if you're ever in town and you have any interest in attending Performance Meetup, come check me out, shoot me a tweet, and we'll go from there. So what are we here to talk about? We're going to talk about web performance to an extent, certainly, but also how it correlates to user experience, because to an extent they sort of go hand in hand. There's never been a site too fast that hasn't been pleasurable, but we know that for slow sites and everything that goes that comes along with a slow site is nothing that users usually like. And you could tell from most of the comments that you read online or at like app stores, are like, hey, things are too slow, this is not working, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about that today. That being said, welcome to Planet of the APIs, a tale of user experience and performance. And I'm going to talk about browser APIs specifically. I'm a big fan of browser. I'm a big fan of browser engineers for all the work that they do. There is chaos taking place, believe me, behind the beautiful screen that you look at on your phones. If you ever open up DevTools, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And we're going to get into that very quickly right now. So that being said, let's go. The web is 30 years old. I mean, I think it's pretty fantastic if you look at where the web started and where we are today. The web, once upon a time, was largely academic, almost textual information, but it's definitely progressed to what we have today. Now, that being said, the browser is actually just over 25 years old. And that's another feat, an incredible feat, if you really think about it, being able to sort of like get information, and everything that we see today in the browser happening is, I think, an incredible piece of engineering. Now, some of you may or may not remember this early browser right here. This is the one that really started this movement that we're going to talk about. And in fact, this is Mosaic, by the way. I forget that this is being recorded, so for all the people out there. It was said that this software is going to change everything, and that's by Marc Andreessen, who had actually led the team of engineers who built this browser. And further to that, another fantastic quote that I love, which is this one right here, which is, for me, things started exploding with the invention of the browser, Mosaic, because suddenly the internet was accessible to the average person. This was Kim Polisi, another very influential, early influential tech entrepreneur in the Bay Area. But I'd like to sort of hang on to this quote right here, which is, or this part of the quote, which is, the internet was accessible to the average person. It was to an extent, but we're going to see how we're going to see in the next little while how we wanted to make sure that it is actually happening, because right now the kind of resources that we're handling are making the experience, not necessarily friction-free, and that's what we're trying to do: create a smooth experience for users. Now, there was an explosion when the browser was first released. We're talking about 65 million users in 18 months. That was 1993, and that was an adoption rate that had never been seen prior to this moment, like not any kind of software that was out there. So there was some excitement around this, this sort of like internet and browser landscape. But if we fast forward 25 years later, which is more or less today, we're looking at this kind of stat. We have 4.3 billion users on the net right now, and we actually haven't even, well, I mean, we've scratched the surface, but we're about halfway through. So there are quite a few people who are not yet on the net. And if you think about it, all these people that are getting on the net today are doing it through one particular means, and this is nothing that we could have expected 25 years ago, which is the mobile device. You have people right now, not necessarily in North America or say the G7 countries, but in other territories, who are basically accessing the net for the very first time in their lives using mobile phones. And there's a very good argument, in fact, that they will only use mobile phones potentially throughout their entire lives. They may not ever discover a desktop because they don't need to. They've been introduced to the net via the mobile phone, and being it that it's the portable device that it is, there's no need to really access a desktop at that point. Now, something else that's very important in this sort of discussion is the fact that in 2016, November, we actually hit this very important inflection point, which was the following right here. Mobile and tablet internet usage exceeded desktop for the first time worldwide, and this was late 2016. So you essentially have a situation where the fact that it ticked right past desktop, you're not going to be going back. Like, in no time from now until, the end of whatever, you're not going to have people say, you know what, let me put this iPhone down. I'm about this desktop right now. It's not going to happen. So with that being said, there's always a conversation about mobile first, mobile this. It's really just mobile. And with that being said, you have to actually take in consideration the fact that when dealing with resource loading on mobile, there is some friction involved. And we're going to talk about that pretty much throughout this talk. Now, just to sort of give you an idea of what it's like out there in the world, let's look at some mobile versus desktop data. And I'm going to talk about these territories, and you'll see why in a hot second. You can see how the breakdown is happening. It's mostly a mobile environment, anywhere from 2 to 1, sometimes to 3 to 1. And I mean, these are just territories in general. We can really start to deep dive and look at properties like retailers. I was looking at, don't judge me, but I was looking at Victoria's Secret. And basically, it is like an 80-20 mobile desktop split. So you have these kind of situations taking place. But in territories like India, Asia, Africa, we can go on to APAC and things like that. You have an explosion in usage. And if you can see the data right there, and I apologize about the colors because sometimes projectors aren't that faithful to our designs. But you can essentially see where there's explosive growth. Asia, 2,000% or 1,500% since 2000, but you see what's happening in Africa, you see what's happening in India. And this is just part of some of the territories that are having explosive growth in sort of like accessing the internet. And this is all being done. Why? Because mobile phones are available. And I can start to parse the reasons why it's all mobile as well, but I mean, I'll get into that if I have a little bit more time. But this next photo is one that I love because it's very emblematic of the penetration of mobile devices, and it's this one right here. So if you think about this, if you look at this photo right here, you'll see that this is a community that has, for the most part, shunned technology for their own reasons, but the mobile device has been able to sort of like penetrate and, be part of their lives. And, she's having ice cream in the background, reading the paper, but her friend is, checking her Facebook updates, something like that. But I think to me, when I saw this photo, this was very just powerful to me. And this is what is happening worldwide. So that being said, we all have mobile phones here. We do everything on our phones. We essentially pay bills. We get paid. We order Uber Eats. We flip through IG. We slide in DMs. It's all being done on mobile. So that being said, if we're on mobile a lot, we're also at the mercy of mobile and its limitations. And in a performance space, we like to talk about the network. You might have seen this tweet I put out earlier. Maybe you didn't, but it'll come back a little later. But global network connections aren't necessarily what they're like in Metro Atlanta. Most of you on 4G, 5G around the corner, depending on whether or not Huawei gets their say. But that was a bad joke. But 4G is definitely in the metro areas. But once you start to leave metro areas, it gets a little softer. Quite often you'll get 3G. In some cases, you'll get 2G. If you're traveling, say, on a train, you're going to go see relatives, and you'll see that connection gets a little spotty. People still live in these areas, and they have these challenges in having to access information. So this is why we always keep in the performance space, we always keep this kind of data in mind. Now, you'll be able to see this click the links in the deck that I've made available. But this is a great episode of a podcast where they talk about where in America, you see people sometimes hanging out outside of libraries. Why? Because this is their only access to the internet, or some affordable internet. And they'll sit there for like hours, try to get whatever might be done, work, or, looking for work or anything like that. So we have to understand that, we are in the metro area pretty privileged to have like some relatively decent connections, but outside of the metro areas, it doesn't get that much, it's not a lot of fun. So let's talk about what it is that we are downloading, what it is that we are using, what it is that is powering our devices. There are resources, from images to JavaScript especially. Now, I like to look at this kind of data and to give you an idea of the kind of like the resources that we are downloading to our devices. Now, you'll see right here, this is a desktop and mobile comparison, and you'll see mobile is not that far behind. And we find that a bit alarming simply because we know the mobile device does not have the capabilities of a desktop. And this is where we talk about disciplined resource loading. And specifically here, you'll see that obviously we usually like to talk about median, talk about the median, but in the last, this is over a 2-year period, in the last 2 years, you'll see that the JavaScript bytes that we're sending down to the desktop are up about 50%. And this is just a trend. Now, we also talk about image bytes because at the end of the day, when you talk about resources online, the most prevalent, the heaviest resource online will be, and absolutely all the time, images. So we talk about images and how they can impact the user experience and the resource loading. And now here you'll see that on mobile devices over the last 2 years, images are up 25% in terms of image bytes. And to an extent, they're up on desktop as well. But if you look at this on a per request basis, we're actually sending the same amount of bytes to the mobile device than we are to the desktop. And again, these are things that we have to keep in mind. I mentioned quite often that responsive web design is a distant cousin to performance because responsive web design, as easy as it may sound on paper, the mistakes that are made are very crucial because quite often enough, you make those mistakes with images and they are very costly in the end. Now, let's look at some quick data. This is something that we talked about on Monday at the AMP Roadshow. This is a known piece of data from, my God, what was it? It's actually a Google DoubleClick study where 53% of visitors will abandon a page that take 3 seconds or more to load on mobile phone, and that's at 3G. Now, expanding on that, 77% of pages load in 10 seconds or more, with the average page loading in 19 seconds. Now, I mentioned on Monday, 19 seconds may not seem like a lot, but let's have fun and look at what 19 seconds feels like. And this is a true fact right here. Does this work? Okay. So you may remember this from a few years ago. News organizations were stunned because it was actually a 19-second handshake. And they talked about how awkward that whole moment was. And it kept going on and on and on and on, and bam. Then you have, that was 19 seconds. So you kind of felt how cringe-worthy that was. But think about sitting on the phone waiting for something to load for 19 seconds, where you probably would have turned the channel there and you'd probably leave that same website right there. So I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what that was like. So essentially, pages aren't fast enough, and we talk about browser interventions that are coming down the pipe, and I'm going to talk about that. Here's a little quote that I personally like because it's my own. Resource loading is a delicate dance, which it is. And it can be delightful, but also destructive due to device damper and limitations. But the key, actually, is this one right here. You cannot improve what you can't measure. And that's something very important. I'm a 5K runner. I could never imagine running a 5K without my watch, because as fast as I might think I'm going, I have no idea. And I know I would have no idea how to improve my race if I didn't have my watch. And this is the same here. We're going to talk about some of these APIs that are going to help us sort of make these measurements. And if I jump back to historically some moments, who remembers Firebug? Okay, a few of you. Firebug was actually first introduced for two things: pre and post-load measurements. That's what Joe Hewitt did. I remember going back and watching some of his videos, and he specifically wanted to look at this data because he knew he wanted to have an understanding of what was going on at load time. Web Performance APIs are the browser solution to real-world measurements. And further to that, load is not a single moment in time. It's an experience that no one metric can fully capture. So we're going to look at a bunch of metrics today, and to give you an idea of what we use them for and how they can apply in your ventures. So, and in fact, we have some things like nav timing, user timing APIs, and resource timing that are still great, but we're going to look at some of these more experimental and some that are basically out in the wild for you to use, like I said, in some of your endeavors. Now, who has heard of the paint timing API? Fantastic. For the rest of you, we're going to have fun, and we're going to talk about this, and we're going to see why this is a very good API. So there are four of them right here: first paint, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint, and largest contentful paint. Sounds a little crazy, but roll with me. Let's talk about the first paint. Now, first paint here is defined as the first paint reports the time when the browser first rendered after navigation. This excludes the default background paint, but includes non-default background paint and the enclosing box of an iframe. This is the first key moment developers care about in page load, when the browser has started to render the page. Now, essentially, we're talking about when you're looking at your viewport, when things start to render, when the first sort of like speck of rendering happens and is being rendered to the viewport, to the screen. Now, what this may look like when you're, I mean, it was a tough example, but I really want to use the conference website. You would look at something like this, where there was some painting here, and this indicates that they're like, yes, 2% of the viewport is actually being sort of like painted to. And then you end up going, and eventually more painting happens, and eventually you have the full sort of like paint rendering taking place. But your first actual paint took place, well, actually probably prior to this, but I just used this strip, but it was like 2% pretty much all along. So that first paint likely happened there. Now, we talk about visual completeness when we talk about paint timing. Now, the more important of all four is going to be this one right here, the first contentful paint, what we call for short FCP. It reports the time when the browser first rendered any text, image, non-white canvas or SVG. This excludes any content of iframes, but includes text with pending web fonts. This is the first time users could start to consume a page content. So we like to use this one quite often. Why? Because this is, again, when you see some text coming in, you see some images coming in, and this is where the user's like, oh, something's happening, and I'm going to stick around, and watch the rest of it load up. Now, again, it's still about visual completeness, and to give you an idea of what we think of when we talk about visual completeness, let's look at this sort of graph right here. Now, this is part of this application called webpage test that, some of you may have heard of, but I'd be more than happy to talk about afterwards. When we talk about visual completeness, we try to make sure that we have something happening here so that it's not the load time where there's nothing on the screen and suddenly there's a jump, all right? So we want to make sure there's something being painted to the screen that's going to sort of like keep the user around, and ideally it would kind of go in this kind of trajectory. So something like this, unfortunately, would not be what we call sort of like a friendly user experience. And we try to, when we look at something like this, we know that we want to make some adjustments somewhere so that we can make something a bit more friendly to the user. Now, the first meaningful paint, we get a little bit more complicated, and so much so that, well, you can see right here, first meaningful paint is the paint that follows the biggest layout change. Engineers weren't too crazy about this one, which is why, I don't want to say this is breaking news, but this is sort of going to be deprecated, and it's going to be replaced with this one right here, which is the largest contentful paint. And it's going to be basically the first meaningful paint with some additional details. So as you can see right here, it says in order to better correlate with user experience, which is what we're looking for, LCP represents the speed of delivering main content on the screen. While the main content is important in user experience, it's highly subjective to different users. As an approximation, LCP uses the largest contentful element to represent the main content. So what's going to happen is that we're going to start to look at like the first kind of meaningful paint with some additional details like additional text, images that are appearing to the screen. Now, I put in this little bit right here because it's just about to ship to, I believe, Canary, which is, the experimental end of browsing. So anyone who uses Canary or uses the equivalent of Firefox Nightly or something like STP, which is Safari Tech Preview. So experimental features that are being tested. But if you do go to Canary, you can start to play around with this, or you will be able to play around with it very soon. Now, but the paint though, you'll be able to check that out through some basic JavaScript. Now, obviously, I'm looking at the conference website here. You can actually have the first paint and first contentful paint be the exact same, which is what happened here. And again, the REFACTR Tech website is very interesting in terms of how it was rendered. I think it was like a Vue.js site, so I didn't get into the entrails, but we'll be able to sort of look at that another day. You could actually look at the first paint and first contentful paint in DevTools as well. And again, this is, I believe, it might be unstable, but you could certainly do that in Canary. Now, you may not be able to tell right here. There are these little flags on a timeline, but it'll give you, again, a visual indicator of where the first paint and first meaningful paint or first contentful paint is happening. Now, in terms of support, we have to talk about that. This is what you have across the board. Now, this was obviously supporting Chrome right away and Chromium-based browsers, which means that you're going to have the default Android, you're going to have Samsung Internet, you're going to have Opera, and as you know, now that Edge is actually running off the Chromium engine, pretty much everything that happens on the Chrome side is going to happen on the Edge side as well. So you now have even broader support. Now, you're not going to have Safari in this case, but you are going to have Firefox eventually. And I put this little exclamation mark. Why? Because it's actually supported currently in Firefox Nightly, which is again the experimental end of Mozilla browsing, which means at some point, probably very soon, you're going to see this in Firefox Stable. That was a little long, but thank you very much. I just like the paint timing bit. It's a lot to cover. Intersection Observer. This is actually really cool because, I mean, I used to call it the sort of like lazy loader at the end of the day, and quite often enough, it is being used for lazy loading. Everyone here is familiar with lazy loading? Excellent. And so you can use this pretty much across the board, but we're going to get into the definition right here. Little wordy, but the Intersection Observer API enables developers to understand the visibility position of target DOM elements relative to an intersection route. Now, I'm going to get into this example right here. And it's actually going to show you, and there are quite a few out there that I have linked, I believe, on this deck. There are quite a few out there, but essentially what you'll be able to see right here, because it is being used quite often for lazy loading, and slowly you'll see right here a count of the pages, I mean the images that are being loaded. And again, the idea of lazy loading for mobile devices especially is around the concept of being sort of disciplined with data. You know, not having to load up images that you know are not on the viewport yet. And you could actually start to indicate through some JavaScript where you want the images to load. Do you want the images to load maybe 100 pixels away from the viewport, or you want them to load maybe even within the viewport, within maybe about 10 or 15 pixels into the viewport? It's quite customizable that way. And the good part about this is that you have some pretty decent support. Again, Chromium based outside of Opera, but you have these right here. And best that you have Safari. And quite often enough, Safari is sort of like the last in line in support in some cases. I'm still a Safari default user, you know, so I never bang on them like that. But definitely available right now. They've been making some great improvements there. This is something, it's a little niche, but something that I thought was pretty interesting, Media Capabilities API. So in the cases of, again, where you're looking at territories that may not have like the best, shiniest phones out there, you may have challenges around what the phone is able to do. This is something really interesting that I know Facebook has been sort of playing with. You might be familiar with something called, I think it's called like phone years or something like that. They basically were able to show that even though you may have a brand new phone in 2019, but some of these lower or these less expensive devices are giving you 2015 specs. All right, that's just to sort of like accommodate a particular demographic who may not want to spend $1,000 on a phone. Hello, I don't. But with that being said, you have to actually take in consideration some of the specs that these phones have, even though they're 2019 devices. And something like this, like the Media Capabilities API, would allow you to do so. Now, essentially, it's about being able to query the device and seeing what it's capable of doing. As we know, it's kind of like, I mean, I could use this example where there's an app that was recently released by some developers at, I think, Google I/O, and they talk about making sure that it was accessible to a varying type of clients, and sometimes you had to work with devices that had like Firefox, like a very old version of Firefox, so they couldn't use a particular animation for it. So Media Capabilities API will allow you to do something like that. Now these examples again are I have the links up on the deck you'll be able to look at, but you'll be able to check whether or not, say, whether dealing with audio or even video, whether or not a device will be able to sort of use some of these resources that you plan on setting down. And with that being said, when it cannot, you might be able to create like a fallback so that the user will be able to still participate in what you're trying to load resource-wise without giving them, say, the full fidelity that an iPhone X or Samsung S9 or S8, whatever they have out there, is able to use. Now, with respect to support here, again, pretty decent across the board, not everyone. Of course, unfortunately not Safari, but again, Chromium-based, we have Firefox available here. And again, when you start to look at these stats on a mobile level, between Chrome, say, Android, and then some of the others, you start to look at least north of 50%, 60%, 70% of your users. So you start to look at the analytics, and you see that some of these you can use pretty much right away and get decent coverage. Now, one of my favorites here is the Network Information API, because a lot can happen with this right here. It's again, one of my faves. The Network Information API enables web applications to access information about the network connection in use by the device. Now, if there's one thing I can't sort of stress enough, is knowing that the network connection is extremely variable. All right, you could be downtown Atlanta and 5 minutes later, still downtown, go from 4G to 3G. Or something even worse. So the Network Information API takes that in consideration. So let's look at it right now. So the downlink attribute will represent the effective bandwidth estimate and megabits per second rounded to the nearest multiple of 25 kilobits, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, the downlink will give you an idea of what kind of like download speeds you have. Now, great as that is, I'll always say, download speeds will not tell the whole story. You might remember this, well, you may not know, but this is a study quite some time back talking about bandwidth, but at the end of the day, it's about latency. So bandwidth is great, but latency is always a biggest deal. Now, effective type, here's where one of the more important attributes of the API, it can provide quite a bit of information from your user. Now, you'll be able to tell whether you're on sort of like a 4G, 3G, a 2G, or a slow 2G connection, or kind of like an estimate. And that's important because at that point, you can start to make these decisions like, okay, if my user is on 3G, I may not send down a retina image. I may send down like an SVG. Or if they're on 2G or slower, I may make it like sort of like a textual sort of like layout instead of like a rich visual application. And we'll get into some examples as well. Now, the RTT attribute, round trip times, again, very important. If you're talking about the network, these are the things that you may not sort of like know specifically what's happening, but round trip times is about the latency of the connection. And then we can also have a look at things like save data header. And this is very important because this is something that is used quite often in territories where there is bad connections, where people are like, you know what, I don't want to blow data on some of these rich images that these websites have. And you're going to see how important this is because in territories like overseas, this is very commonplace. And in fact, I remember reading this in a blog post where someone's like, well, I use save data all the time. And by default, I just found out that a lot of people don't use alt tagging properly. Because when the image isn't there, you have to get the alt tag. And they're noticing that a lot of people are sort of like failing that accessibility element. But you didn't hear that from me. But let's look at quickly, again, through some JavaScript, you'll be able to kind of see what you can pull out of there. So I don't know if it's big enough for you can see it at the back. But, and you could jump in and find this out yourself. But it'll tell you, this was, I did this yesterday just to get from the Wi-Fi information. RTT, downlink at 10, save data header, it wasn't turned on, so it was false. And my affected type was 4G here. But you can start to make these sort of interesting decisions based on that. Now, I'm not calling on anyone out, but if the save data header was on, there's a good chance that I may not have loaded this refactor.tech website because it actually transferred about 10 megs onto my device. Now, again, these are images that I likely would have blocked and whatnot, but these are the kind of things that some people are doing because they don't want to blow data caps. They may have a sort of not so generous account from whoever, Verizon or whatever it is out here, they may have only like 250 megs a month. You know, so what do they do about that? This is why things being responsible around the resource loading is very important. Now, let me give you a quick example. If I were, say, a sports reporter, I have my blog or whatever it is, or I'm on, you know, si.com. If my user had the save data header off, I might send them a full photo of Matt Ryan. By the way, never trust anyone with two first names. You know, Matt Ryan, no good. But if I were talking about and that's maybe a retina image, but if I were talking about the Falcons and they had the save data header on, I might send them the logo. And the difference is I might send an FVG because it's going to be a ton smaller, only a few colors. It'll probably compress better because I could probably gzip it or broadly. So suddenly I might have something that's like 200 kilobytes here or maybe 100, but this might end up being 3. So I can still provide a bit of a story here, but with different resources. So these are things that we think about all the time. And the best part about this, it's pretty much well supported across the board. Again, unfortunately, not with Safari, but I mean, there are workarounds. You could do some of the same without this API. Now, I'm going to round this off with probably something a bit controversial, which is the battery status API. This is one that was actually deprecated. And I've given this talk before. People are like, oh man, you know, like what's up with that? But you're going to see why I'm kind of mentioning it still. And basically, it's going to provide some information about, you know, the charge of the battery. And, I mean, battery levels and whatnot. And I say this simply because resources like images and, I mean, all resources, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, images, but images and JavaScript especially, very toxic to the battery. Eats up a lot of battery power. And in fact, a couple of days ago, Safari just released I think Safari 13, and they have actually a new panel, and you could actually check on the CPU usage of your either desktop or device, a mobile device, and you'll see this was actually on ESPN.com, and this is just like the first load, and it was eating up a lot of CPU power, and this is happening on your mobile device as well. This is just like one page. Now, with the battery status API, you might be able to say, hey, you know, if you're on like 20% or 15%, I may not want this page to load, or I may give you a warning or something of the sort. And even though, again, it has been deprecated, there's still some very good support across the board. I mean, you could play with it and whatnot. There's really some security issues around the fact that it was around, so that's why it was deprecated first by, I think, Firefox and then Safari. But it is still around. It's something worth playing around with to see how it works. But again, you still have a lot of support across the board to play with it. And again, this is all for the user and their experience. Now, we've gone through a bunch right here, and like I said, some are experimental, some are definitely ones that you want to use right away, but what can you do with it, say, in the practical sense? Let's look at the first contentful pane of, say, some area news publications. Thank you. First contentful pane of area news publications. So let's start with CNN, all right? Now, I talked about the first contentful pane, and the way this chart reads is the following. You want to get as much of your users getting a good first contentful pane in terms of like percentage of users, and this is the timeline. So these are 200 millisecond bins. So you can see right here that the majority are getting some content, say from 1 second to about 2 seconds, and then you have this kind of long tail. Not bad, but it can be improved. because if we look at something like the Atlanta Journal Constitution, yeah, I just put con because I was like too sick of typing. They're actually doing a better job because they get a better percentage of users getting some early painting happening, say from like half a second to 2 seconds, even more. Not bad at all right? And then when you look at WSB TV, now I remember being on the website, they don't have a lot of content, but the fact is they're doing an even better job. And you can see again, a greater percentage of people getting contentful paints early on, and then they still have a bit of a long tail, but that's really a great look right there. And ultimately, and this was a bit of a shocker to me, and again, it all depends on the kind of content that you have on a page, but you'll see 11 Alive, I guess, someone told me to go look at that. They're actually doing a pretty decent job. And again, it might be the fact that they don't have a lot of content on that first load, but whether they did that by design or not, they're getting probably more attention from the users right away. Now, all that being said, you can actually use some of this information to your own advantage. Now, you may work at a company that has like 3 or 4 different competitors. These are the kind of things you want to look at. Are you delivering more content faster and at a sort of like better data cost than the next competitor that you may have? And that being said, in the future, there are a lot of things that the engineers are working on. They call them hints, some call them interventions, but this is just to give you an idea of what they're trying to do. So I talked about lazy loading earlier with the intersection observer. Lazy loading is actually being implemented in the browser as an API now. So I believe Chrome is shipping that. There are things like if they find out that you're at or near 2G, they're going to have a no script sort of like intervention potentially. So these are things that are being discussed. There are things like heavy page capping that was actually in the experimental canary at one point, was pulled just over like some UI issues. But these are things that are being discussed, like, hey, if this page is past 3 megs on first load, we may cap it. They're not sure how, but they're thinking of capping these resources. So all that being said, what are we trying to do? We're trying to be disciplined in the delivery of data for our users. It's going to create a better experience. It's going to create largely faster sites. And at the end of the day, it's going to create a happy user. And with that being said, I want to thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have any questions,